The grand orrery of the galactic concordat was a monument to order. It spun in the void between star systems, a sphere of crystalline latticework and gravitic plates that held 1,000 atmospheres in delicate, isolated bubbles. Within its heart, the council chamber was a place of profound and ancient silence, broken only by the soft hum of universal translators and the carefully modulated tones of beings who had measured their lives in millennia. Light sourced from a captured singularity refracted through the domed ceiling, casting long, solemn shadows across the tiered platforms where the delegates sat. Ambassador Arthur Kensington, representing the Sol system and its fledgling interstellar coalition, felt profoundly out of place. He was a creature of noise and weather, of variable gravity and untidy emotions. Here, surrounded by silica-based life forms, gaseous sentience contained in shimmering fields and beings of such intricate biology they defied simple description, he felt like a blacksmith at a watchmaker's convention. Clumsy, loud, and overly solid, he cleared his throat, the sound a dull thud in the acoustically perfect chamber. "Esteemed members of the Concordat," he began, his voice calm and measured, a carefully practiced facade of the serenity he saw all around him. "The proposed realignment of the Cygnus X1 hyperlane is not merely an issue of commercial convenience for the Terran Alliance. It is a matter of strategic security. The existing route passes too close to the unfettered zones, regions still rife with piratical remnants from the Cathar Wars." Across the chamber, seated on a throne of polished obsidian that seemed to drink the light, Xyloc of the Glycan hegemony listened with an expression of sublime boredom. His form was elegant, a slender, bipedal frame of pearlescent white chitin, with 4 delicate, multi-jointed arms that rested gracefully on his lap. His head was smooth and elongated, his face dominated by 2 large, multifaceted eyes that glittered like black diamonds. The Glycan did not have mouths. They communicated through direct telepathic projection, a method they considered infinitely more refined than the vulgar vibrations of vocal cords. Such crude arguments, Xyloc projected, his thought voice a silken, condescending whisper that slid directly into the minds of every delegate. Security, commerce, the bleating of a herd animal concerned with the proximity of wolves. They do not understand the great currents of the galaxy. They see only the next patch of grass, a ripple of assent, some amused, some genuinely agreeing, passed through the assembled minds. The humans were newcomers, barely a century on the galactic stage. They were loud, emotionally volatile, and bred at a rate that many elder species found alarming. They were considered a curiosity, a race of clever barbarians who had somehow stumbled upon faster-than-light travel. Kensington felt the psychic whisper and ignored it, a skill he had painstakingly learned. To engage with a Glycan's casual disdain was to lose. "The wolves," as the esteemed delegate from the Glycan hegemony puts it, "have cost the lives of over 300 souls in the last standard year alone. These are not abstract concerns, they are realities paid for in blood." Xyloc's multifaceted eyes swiveled to fix on Kensington. The human was proving to be an irritant. The Glycan had significant investments in the current hyperlane infrastructure. A realignment would be costly. The human's appeal to emotion, blood, how pathetically visceral, was swaying some of the more sentimental species. It was time to end this, not with debate but with information. A gentle, imperceptible probe into the ambassador's mind would reveal his true negotiating position, his fallback strategies, the hidden fears and desires that could be used as leverage. It was a technique Xyloc had perfected over centuries. It was no more invasive to him than reading an opponent's posture in a physical duel. He focused his formidable intellect. A tendril of pure psionic energy, finer than a strand of silk and just as strong, detached from his consciousness. It slid across the silent gulf of the chamber, invisible, undetectable to any but the most powerful telepaths. It ghosted past the translator field surrounding the human and touched the edge of his mind. Xyloc expected the usual surface chaos of a biological mind. The swirling anxieties of the present debate, the lingering taste of the morning's meal, a fleeting thought about his mate or offspring back on their homeworld. He was prepared to sift through this mental detritus to find the core data he needed. The tendril slipped in, surface thoughts. Damned Glycan arrogance, Have to hold firm on the casualty numbers. Did I remember to reset the chronometer on my quarters? Wonder what Sarah is doing right now. Standard, predictable noise. Zylok pushed deeper, past the conscious stream, toward the structured memories and logical frameworks of the subconscious. He was an artist at this, a master of mental archaeology. He moved with grace and precision, and then he hit it. It wasn't a shield. Psychic shields were constructs, brittle and artificial. He could shatter them like glass. This was something else entirely. It was a wall of static. A dense, primal foundation that felt less like a part of a mind and more like a feature of geology. It was ancient, vast, and utterly indifferent. It felt like the bedrock of a world. Intrigued, a flicker of professional curiosity overriding his arrogance, Zylok pushed. He applied a sliver more pressure, expecting the static to resolve into archived memories or instinctual drives. The static did not resolve. It reacted. The push, to Zylok's refined senses, was a gentle inquiry. To the thing that slumbered at the base of Arthur Kensington's brain, it was the snap of a twig in the dead of night. It was the scent of an unknown predator on the wind. It was the sudden, chilling silence of the forest that signals the presence of a stalker. For 100 million years, life on Earth had been defined by a simple, brutal binary: eat or be eaten. That imperative had carved pathways into the very structure of the human brain, deep channels of instinct that lay dormant beneath the thin, fragile veneer of civilization and diplomacy. Zylok's probe, in its alien arrogance, had not just knocked on the door. It had jimmied the lock to the oldest, darkest room in the house of the human soul. And something inside woke up. In the chamber, Ambassador Kensington paused, his mouth slightly open. He blinked, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. "My apologies," he murmured, his voice a fraction unsteady. "I lost my train of thought." For Zylok, the universe had just ended. The council chamber, the delegates, the light of the captured singularity. It all dissolved into a screaming vortex of nonsensation. He was no longer a body on an obsidian throne. He was a point of disembodied consciousness, and he was being pulled. A force of unimaginable gravity had seized his psychic tendril and was dragging his entire being down a well of raw, primordial awareness. He tried to sever the connection, to retreat, but it was too late. The tendril was no longer his. It was a leash. The world resolved itself with a violent sensory shock. The sterile, filtered air of the orrery was gone, replaced by the thick, humid stench of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the musky scent of large animals. The perfect silence was shattered by the buzz of insects, the chattering of unseen primates, and the distant, mournful cry of a bird. Cold, wet mud squelched around his conceptual feet. Dappled, greenish light filtered down through the canopy of a vast, primeval jungle of ferns and colossal trees he had no name for. Disoriented, terrified, Zylok tried to make sense of his surroundings. This was a memory, the human's memory. But it was more real, more vivid than any memory had a right to be. He felt the humidity on his chitin, a sensation he had never physically experienced. He could smell the chlorophyll and the rot. He saw them then. A small group of figures moving through the undergrowth. They were shorter than Kensington, more robust, covered in thick hair. Their brows were heavy, their jaws powerful. They carried sharpened sticks, their points hardened in fire. They moved with a fluid, silent purpose, their dark, intelligent eyes scanning every shadow, every rustle of leaves. They were hunters. They were tracking something. Zylok felt a flicker of his old superiority. Primitives. This was the foundation of the human mind. This savage squalor, then he felt it, a cold spot in the suffocating heat of the jungle. A focused point of attention. It wasn't coming from the hunters in the memory. They were oblivious to him, mere actors on a stage. It was coming from the stage itself, from the awareness that was running the memory. It was the director of this play, and it had noticed an uninvited guest in the audience. It was a feeling he had never known. He was a glycan, a member of a species that had mastered its planet's ecosystem millennia ago. The concept of being prey was a biological myth, a chapter in their ancient history. But this feeling, it was unmistakable. It was the chilling certainty that something was watching him. Something was hunting him. Panic, a raw and unfamiliar emotion, flared in his mind. He had to get out. He focused his will, trying to force his consciousness back to the council chamber, back to the safety of his own body. The jungle dissolved around him, not from his own power, but because the hunter had decided to change the terrain. The world snapped into a new reality. The humid air was replaced by a biting, freezing wind that carried the stench of iron and smoke. The ground was no longer soft mud, but a churned, bloody morass littered with splintered shields and broken bodies. The sky was gray and weeping a miserable, cold rain. He was in a forest of tall, dark pines, the ground between them a scene of horrific carnage. Men in iron helmets and leather armor lay twisted among men with wild hair and animal pelts. The clash of swords and the guttural screams of dying men echoed through the trees. Teutoburg Forest. A name he did not know, but a reality that was absolute. He was in the middle of an ambush. A Roman legion, shattered and surrounded. But the soldiers, Roman and Germanic alike, were not the threat. They were the environment. The threat was the strategy. The cold, brutal, and lethally intelligent cunning that had engineered this slaughter. He felt it as a pressure on all sides, a pincer of pure predatory logic closing in on him. It was the mind of a pack hunter, using the terrain, the weather, the chaos as its weapons. He fled. He threw his consciousness forward, a desperate psychic dash for any exit, any way back to the real. The landscape shifted again, mud, but a different kind of mud. Deeper, thicker, pockmarked with craters filled with stagnant, foul-smelling water. Barbed wire like thorny metallic vines snaked across the blasted, treeless landscape. The air thrummed with a constant, soul-shaking bass note, the endless thunder of artillery. A flare went up, casting a sickly green, momentary daylight over a scene from hell. The psalm. This wasn't the swift cunning of the ambush. This was the hunt of attrition. This was the relentless, patient pressure of a predator that knows it can outlast its prey. The hunter didn't need to catch him. It would simply wear him down, exhaust him, break his spirit under a bombardment of horror and despair. The very atmosphere was a weapon, pressing down on his mind, suffocating his will to resist. He was a fox in a field, and the combines were slowly, inexorably, closing in from all sides. He could feel the hunter's patience, its absolute certainty of the outcome. It was a cold, grinding terror that was worse than any swift attack. He had to hide. He needed a moment of peace, a place to gather his shattered thoughts. He dove deep, searching for a memory, any memory that was not steeped in bloodshed and fear. He found one, a quiet, sun-drenched garden, the smell of roses and freshly cut grass, the gentle warmth of a summer afternoon, a memory of Kensington's childhood. He threw himself into it like a drowning man lunging for a life raft. The peace was intoxicating. He stood on a perfectly manicured lawn, surrounded by vibrant flower beds. A sense of calm, of safety, washed over him. He had found a sanctuary. He had outsmarted the hunter. The trap snapped shut. The scent of roses turned to the smell of decay. The green lawn withered to black dust under his conceptual feet. The blue sky cracked like glass, revealing a void of absolute darkness behind it. The garden walls stretched upwards to infinity, smooth and featureless. They were not walls of brick or stone. They were walls of pure, focused intent. He was caged, the bait had been taken. The hunt was over. The capture was complete, a presence formed in the darkness before him. It had no definite shape. It was a pillar of shadow, a distortion in the nothingness, but within it, 2 points of light ignited. They were not eyes in a biological sense. They were apertures into the core of the thing that had hunted him. They glowed with a cold, dispassionate, terrifyingly ancient intelligence. This was not Arthur Kensington, the mild-mannered diplomat. This was the architect of the hunt. This was the cumulative survival instinct of a billion generations of apex predators. It was the thing that had sharpened sticks, forged swords, dug trenches, and survived ice ages and asteroid impacts. It was the will to live, honed into a weapon. It did not speak in words. It communicated in raw, brutal concepts that bypassed all language and stabbed directly into his consciousness. A single, recurring question, projected with the force of a physical blow. What are you? The question was not a request for his species or his name. It was a demand for his place in the fundamental binary. Predator or prey. Before he could formulate a response, it showed him. Images not from Kensington's mind but dredged from the deepest, most terrified corners of his own. It showed him the swamps of Glycan Prime, long before civilization. It showed him his own ancestors, smaller, softer-shelled creatures, being snatched from the reeds by winged reptilians, being crushed by armored behemoths. It ripped away the millennia of cultural superiority and forced him to confront the forgotten terror of being food. He screamed in his mind, a sound of pure, abject horror. Prey, the entity concluded, the concept a brand of pure ice on his soul. Then came the next question, a dissecting probe of cold logic. Why are you here? It showed him his own actions from its perspective. The silent, slithering tendril of thought, the trespass, the probing of defenses, stalker, infiltrator, threat. It was not an accusation, it was a diagnosis, a dispassionate classification of a foreign body. It was the same logic a T-cell uses to identify a virus. And the protocol was the same: neutralize, isolate, destroy. It began to peel him apart, not with violence but with understanding. It flooded his mind with the very essence of what it was. It showed him the savage joy of a successful mammoth hunt, the grim satisfaction of outthinking an enemy on the battlefield, the iron-willed endurance of a lone explorer freezing in a blizzard, forcing himself to take one more step, then one more. It showed him the cold calculus of a surgeon cutting away diseased flesh to save the body. He was the disease. The entity wasn't angry. Anger was a high-level emotion, a luxury of the conscious mind. This thing was far older and more fundamental. It operated on a level of pure, pragmatic survival. Xyloc was an unknown variable, a potential danger that had breached the perimeter. It needed to be understood, catalogued, and rendered harmless. The interrogation was not for information. It was for dismantlement. What are your weaknesses? The entity asked, and it didn't wait for an answer. It found them. It found his pride and showed him how it was nothing more than the puffed-up display of a frightened animal. It found his reliance on logic and flooded him with the absolute, irrefutable logic of predation. It found his fear of the physical, the visceral, the messy reality of life and death, and it drowned him in it. He felt his sense of self, his ego, his very identity being flayed layer by layer. He was no longer Xyloc of the Glycan hegemony, a master telepath, a delegate of an elder race. He was just a terrified consciousness, trapped in a cage of absolute terror, being systematically unmade by something he couldn't fight, couldn't reason with, and couldn't possibly comprehend. It was the ultimate predator, not because of its strength but because of its adaptability. It had used the forest to channel him, the battlefield to flank him, the trenches to exhaust him, and his own mind to dissect him. It learned, it adapted, and it always survived. And now it had him. And it would not let go. Back in the Grand Orrery, only 3.7 seconds had passed. Ambassador Kensington had just finished his apology for losing his train of thought. He blinked, his eyes refocusing, a slight frown on his face as if trying to recall a forgotten word. Then the silence of the chamber was not merely broken, it was annihilated. A scream ripped through the air. It was a sound of such raw, primal terror that it defied the ordered physics of the room. It wasn't a vocalization. It was a psychic detonation. Xyloc of the Glycan hegemony was rigid on his obsidian throne, his slender body convulsing violently. His multifaceted eyes, once glittering with arrogant intelligence, were now wide, blank, and mirrored a horror that was not in the room. The scream wasn't just audible to the species with ears. It was a blast of pure psychic agony that hit every sentient mind in the chamber. The other telepathically gifted delegates, the crystalline sea thona, the gaseous lumina, the silicon-based alg, reeled back as if struck by a physical blow. Their minds were flooded with the echo of Xyloc's experience. They felt it, the exhilarating terror of the hunt, the crushing weight of the chase through millennia of bloodshed, the absolute, suffocating cold of the final capture. And most terrifying of all, they felt the hunter. They felt the vast, ancient, and utterly implacable intelligence that had claimed the Glycan. It was a brief, momentary touch, a psychic splash from Xyloc's shattered mind, but it was enough. It was a glimpse into the engine room of the human soul, and what they saw there was a perfectly honed killing machine, perfected by eons of relentless, brutal struggle. Xyloc collapsed, sliding from his throne onto the polished floor. His limbs twitched. A thin, viscous fluid, the glycan equivalent of blood, trickled from the joinings of his chitinous plates. He began to mutter, his telepathic voice no longer a silken whisper but a broken, terrified babble that echoed in the heads of the psychics, the eyes, always watching. It never stops, the hunger, it learned me. It's inside, no, no, pray, Kensington turned, his expression one of genuine, if slightly detached, concern. Is the delegate all right? He asked, his voice steady. He looked at the convulsing alien, then back at the stunned council. He had no memory of what had just transpired in the depths of his own mind. His internal defense system had identified a threat, neutralized it, and filed the report away in a place his conscious mind could never access. He simply felt a strange, fleeting sense of resolution, as if a minor annoyance had been dealt with. The Glycan delegation rushed to their fallen leader, their own minds reeling from the psychic feedback. The chamber, once a bastion of serene order, was now filled with a new, thick silence. It was a silence of profound and dawning horror. Every delegate, from the oldest star-faring race to the newest initiate, turned their eyes, or sensors, or psychic foci, upon the human ambassador. They no longer saw a representative of a loud, primitive, upstart species. They saw a vessel, a container for something that slept and which they had now, inadvertently, seen awakened. They had spent decades studying human culture, their art, their science, their chaotic history. They had dismissed the endless wars, the genocides, the relentless expansion and consumption as signs of primitive immaturity. They had been wrong. It wasn't immaturity. It was practice. They were looking at a species that had clawed its way to the top of its planet's food chain not with venom or claws or armor, but with a brain that could outthink, outlast, and outkill anything it encountered. A brain that saw a challenge and immediately began to devise 1,000 ways to dismantle it. A brain whose deepest, most fundamental instinct when confronted with the unknown was not to cower or to greet, but to ask a single, terrifying question. Can I kill it? The debate about the hyperlane was forgotten. All the delicate political maneuverings, the trade agreements, the centuries of established galactic hierarchy, it all seemed like a children's game now. The galaxy had spent millennia worrying about empires, armadas, and cosmic cataclysms. But the greatest threat might not have come from the stars at all. It had come from a muddy little world in the galactic suburbs, a world that had bred the perfect predator, wrapped it in a fragile shell of flesh and diplomacy, and sent it out into an unsuspecting cosmos. The other races had evolved in ecosystems. Humanity had evolved to conquer them. Ambassador Arthur Kensington stood in the center of the chamber, looking around at the sea of terrified alien faces with a polite, questioning expression, utterly unaware that he was the most dangerous thing in the room. The silence stretched, thick with a fear that would reshape the future of the galaxy. They finally understood. Man was not a wolf in sheep's clothing. He was something far more terrifying. He was the hunter who had learned to smile, and to talk, and to wait. And the galaxy was his new, boundless hunting ground.